We'll speak to a member of the Scottish Conservative Party on this very point, Dr. Sandesh Gulhane, Shadow Secretary for Health. But first, let's get a little bit more detail on this. Political commentator and author Iain Macwhirter is with us. Iain, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
This, of course, was, I mean, we've all talked about governments in all parts of the country have talked about drugs and what to do about it for many, many years. There was a sense that in Scotland, things were going to improve. I remember Nicola Sturgeon a few years ago making quite a lot of noise about this. How has Scotland in particular taken almost a reverse gear on this? What do you think has happened?
Well, it's, you rightly say that the Scottish National Party, and particularly Nicola Sturgeon, kind of thought they had the answer to the drug problem in Scotland, which is of long standing. She thought, and they thought, and most of her advisors said, that the thing to do is to stop treating drug abuse as a criminal matter and treat it as a public health matter.
Yeah.
And remove, as they put it, the stigma of addiction. And this is what they've been doing, really, for most of the last decade. And 3 years ago, the Lord Advocate, Dorothy Bain, actually effectively decriminalised the possession of hard drugs in Scotland. She announced in Parliament, speaking on behalf of the Scottish government. She's a political appointee, she sits in cabinet. She was speaking on behalf of the Scottish government, saying that in future, police should not prosecute people who are caught with Class A drugs for personal use. She was drawing a distinction there, obviously, between the supply and the possession. But effectively, that decriminalised the possession of Class A drugs, cocaine, crystal meth, heroin, tranks, all the rest of it. In future, you could be clear that if you were caught with a small amount, you're not going to risk prison, you're not going to risk jail. Now, they thought this would lead to a new climate of approaches to drugs in Scotland. The addicts would be diverted into rehabilitation services, they would be given education, they would be given treatment, and everything would be fine. 3 years on, clearly, that has not worked. They've removed the stigma from drug addiction. They've effectively decriminalised drugs, hard drugs, I should say, not just cannabis. We're talking about the serious Class A drugs here. But drug deaths continue to rise, and they've gone up by 12%, which is a shocking figure, and one which took everybody by surprise, including most of the drug charities, who didn't expect it to be anything like as serious as this.
What do we extrapolate from this then, Iain? Is it, I mean, I suppose a casual observer would say, well, if you decriminalise something, more people do it. I'm sure it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, well, that's the common sense observation, which you're not really allowed to make in Scotland at the moment because that goes contrary to the prevailing wisdom. And people say, with some truth, that it is to a certain extent a social problem, that you find drug addiction in areas of multiple deprivation amongst people who have severe mental health issues, have demoralisation, have all sorts of psychological problems.
Yeah.
All that's perfectly true. But at the same time, if you just say, well, that's fine, we've lifted the stigma of addiction, we don't think you're bad people anymore, we know that you've got problems, but, what's going to make, is that going to make them stop taking these very dangerous drugs? Yeah. And I think the most worrying thing about this is that there's a certain naivety about decriminalisation, because essentially it just hands the entire trade into the pockets of the drug cartels who manage and run all this. Because, of course, they don't take part in the actual distribution of drugs. They devolve it to small runners who take small quantities of drugs around the country and sell it to drug addicts. They now are pretty sure they're never going to be prosecuted. Most of them wouldn't anyway, because they tend to use people who are underage. And also their customers now don't need to worry about being prosecuted. So it kind of makes the trade an awful lot easier. And it makes life a lot easier for both sides. And that may ultimately lead to people being more willing to get off drugs, but I've yet to be convinced that that is actually the case.
There is, I have no evidence really to back this up, Iain, but I'm throwing it out there anyway. There is a sense from some politicians, whether they're in Scotland, England, wherever, that just by dint of sort of decriminalising it, they've done something Amazing, you know, this is proof that horrible word progressive. This is progressive thinking. You know, we're not like the old days when they used to lock you up for 20 years because you smoked a suspicious cigarette. We understand it's a different world now. And in doing so, it's almost as if, well, job done. We've decriminalised it. What could go wrong?
Well, I think you put your finger on it. I think they thought this rhetorical change was actually a serious policy change, a policy change which would have an effect on the ground. And I don't see there was any reason to suppose that it would. I mean, I don't think people who take drugs should be demonized. I mean, very often they are, you know, they are people with complex health and mental difficulties. Nevertheless, you've got to find some way of stopping this trade, because we now have the third generation of communities where, you know, parents, grandparents have been on drugs, and this has now become a very entrenched culture. Now, what's happened is that now if a parent finds their son or daughter consuming hard drugs, they can say, well, look, what's wrong about this? You know, I mean, the government says it's okay for personal use. You know, what's your beef? And that's going to be a real difficulty for people who are trying to get their loved ones off these chemicals. The people who oppose this kind of liberalisation, such as Dr. Neil McKeganey of the Glasgow Substance Misuse Unit, have been kind of marginalised in recent years. You never really hear their voices any longer. The approach has been entirely dominated by this public health message, which, as you rightly indicate, is largely a rhetorical change and doesn't seem to be making much of an impact on the ground.
And missing, you know, that's 50% of this story, isn't it? That's the first bit. What about, you know, what are you going to do about, as you rightly say, the illegal drug trade and all that goes with it? Listen, Iain, thank you for your time, sir. We will speak again, I hope. Fascinating stuff from Iain Macwhirter, political commentator and author. Let's speak to Dr. Sandesh Gulhane, Scottish Tory MSP for Glasgow and Shadow Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. Sandesh, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Now, I'm sure you just about remember the SNP. I think there's a few of them still left there. They, of course, were all guns blazing on this policy. As Iain just referenced there, they were wedded to this idea of decriminalisation and, you know, we're not going to lock anybody up for doing drug Class A's and whatever. But, of course, that really left this huge void, didn't it, which, as Iain alluded to, simply hasn't been addressed. Perhaps that explains why we are where we are.
Well, let's start with the fact that since the SNP came to power 17 years ago, there have been over 14,000 drug deaths. And just this year, you were right in saying that 1,172 families lost a loved one. These are disgusting, appalling figures. And it's the SNP shame. They took their eye off the ball, and it's quite clear that we're seeing the chickens come to roost now. Scotland is soft on crime. We are not looking after victims of crime. And if you decriminalise, effectively, is what you're hearing, what you're seeing is gangs who participate in all sorts of things, from murder to prostitution, profiting, making money out of this disgusting trade, which is costing the lives of people. Now, the SNP is great on words. It's wonderful with its rhetoric, but it doesn't deliver. I'm a GP. I'm actually at work today. And what I can tell you is the way to save lives, the way to stop people dying, is to offer them the choice of not taking whatever substance they happen to be on, whether that be alcohol or drugs. And we can do that if we make sure that when that person's ready for help, we can get help to them quickly. Because right now in Scotland, that's not possible. And the Scottish Conservatives have put forward a plan called the Right to Recovery Bill, which means that if you're somebody who is on substances and you want to stop, there is a legal pathway for you to go forwards and to stop. Now, come on, let's talk about common sense. Someone that wants to stop, surely you want them to do that, and you give them the ability and the framework to do so. That makes sense to me, not some idea about stigma and reducing what the government are talking about. You know, that's not what we need to do. We need to actually help people, and that's why we're failing the people of Scotland. And the SNP are at the heart of this.
I was just going to say, Sandesh, do you sense the same question I put to Iain a second ago, that this was quite a lot of the SNP boys and girls thought it was, you know, a very progressive thing to do, to just decriminalise or really take no notice of it, and in doing so failed to follow that up, because that might be 50% of the story, but there's the follow-up, the treatment. What are you going to do next? Because you otherwise end up in a danger to exactly where we are now with the 12%.
Well, the thing is, it's not 50% of the story. It's simply not. Decriminalising, effectively, is not an answer. And the SNP always take the easy route. They always take the way to go that doesn't involve them actually needing to deliver anything. What we need to see is people being treated and people getting help, and create pathways that are able to do that. And let me give you an example of a patient that I saw last week. They came in asking for help because they saw someone die taking drugs. So they were scared and they want to get off it. And that's fine, we can do that. But what we then do is refer them to the drug and alcohol team, refer them to a clinic. It'll take at least a few weeks for that to come through. Then they get asked, do they still want to come? Then eventually they find an appointment. Now, by that stage, you've lost that person. Yeah. You know, this isn't rocket science. This is common sense. And common sense seems to be completely lacking with the SNP.
There it is. Sandesh, we could talk for longer, but thank you. Some real meat on the bones of that. That's Dr. Sandesh Gulhane, MSP, Shadow Secretary for Health and Social Care.